Welcome back, Dram Fam, to episode 2 of the Whisky Bible. So, you want to understand the whisky producing regions of Scotland? Let me explain. In this episode, we're going to be giving you a pretty brief summary of the whisky producing regions in Scotland. But first, a quick disclaimer. This is a fairly high-level overview of the regions, and there will always be exceptions to the general trends of each region. So treat this more as a guide than a specification. Anyway, Scotch whisky comes from Scotland in the UK, and at present there are 5 officially recognised whisky producing regions of Scotland. Those regions are the Highlands, the Lowlands, Speyside, Campbeltown and Islay. In some cases you may see people refer to a 6th. Now, that's the islands, and although it's not officially recognised, we colloquially kind of refer to it as its own independent region, but more on that later. The largest whisky producing region in Scotland is Speyside in the northeast. There are over 60 distilleries alone in Speyside, and it's home to some of the most famous, like Glenfiddich, the Glenlivet and Macallan. Speyside whiskies tend to be lighter and sweeter than other malts, often with notes like honey and vanilla, apple and pear, and often described as more floral and elegant. Not many Speyside whiskies are considered smoky. Some of them do have a smoke influence, but it's generally quite a soft, sweet smoke. The next region we're going to talk about is the Highlands, which takes up the majority of the northern mainland of Scotland. It's home to around 25 distilleries, the most famous of which being Dalmore, Glenmorangie and Glenfarclas. Highland whiskies tend to carry a lot of the same sort of notes as Speyside, but a lot darker and a lot heavier. You can often find flavours like fruitcake, molasses, fudge, some spiciness, and dried fruits like raisin. You can find some smokiness to them, and they'll maybe be a bit smokier than you'd find from a Speyside. Next, we'll talk about one of the most notable regions of Scotland, Islay. Spelt Islay, pronounced Islay. It's a small island, only about 25 miles long, and it's home to about 8 distilleries. This is where you find all the really big, peaty, smoky whiskies. Arguably, the most famous distilleries on the island are Laphroaig, Lagavulin, Ardbeg, but it's also home to 2 of my favourites, the Bruichladdich and the Bunnahabhain. Islay is quite a boggy island, and thus historically has been quite a good source of peat, although apparently that is not so much the case anymore. Peat, in the absence of dry wood, is a fantastic fuel, which was burnt in the furnaces in order to kiln the barley to be used in making whisky. The byproduct of burning peat is that really pungent smoke, which kind of gets infused into the barley and makes its way all the way through from the dried barley into the final bottle. Which is why the majority of Islay malts are very peaty and very smoky. The sort of flavours you can expect from a pretty standard Islay malt would be smoky, peaty, seaweed, salty, vegetal or medicinal, also known as phenolic. That's due to the high amount of phenols which make it from the peat into the barley. You'll often hear the terms smoky and peaty used fairly interchangeably, but they are not the same. But we'll save that for another video. It's worth noting that not all whiskies from Islay are peated. Take Bunnahabhain, for example. Whilst Bunnahabhain is an Islay whisky and does carry a lot of the other sort of flavour profiles you'd expect of an Islay, like sort of saltiness, they don't use peated barley, so it doesn't have any of those sort of phenolic medicinal flavours that you might find in other Islay whiskies. The next region on our list is Lowland, which takes up the majority of the southernmost part of mainland Scotland. It's only home to a very small number of distilleries. I think it's about 5 or so, and the most famous of which is Auchentoshan. Lowland whiskies tend to be a little less sweet, with a little bit more sort of soft spice and toffee notes. You'll often find their flavours described as creamy, toffee, caramel, floral, ginger, and some spices like nutmeg and cinnamon, but are generally regarded as some of the mildest, lighter bodied whiskies. Our final official region of Scotland is Campbeltown, which is right down on the peninsula on the southwest coast of Scotland. Campbeltown used to be a powerhouse of Scotch whisky and was once home to the largest number of Scotch whisky distilleries in the whole of Scotland. Since around the First World War, due to a number of issues with transport, logistics, supply and demand and quality, the number of whiskies in the area have massively decreased over the years. It's actually now only home to 3 distilleries: Springbank, Glen Scotia and Glengyle. Campbeltown whiskies pretty much have a flavour profile of their own, usually very rich with flavours such as salty and sulphurous, but still retaining some sweetness with notes of dried fruits and caramel and toffee. Campbeltown whisky can also offer a broad range of smokiness, offering some peated and unpeated whiskies in the same region. Lastly, we have the islands, which encompasses all of the small islands that litter the west coast of Scotland. Whilst not formally recognised as their own region, they're home to a growing number of distilleries, such as Jura, Talisker and Arran. Island whiskies can offer a broad spectrum of flavours, which can vary massively from island to island, from salty, dry and vegetal, all the way through to sweet, fruity and nutty. Some of them are even peated and carry some quite smoky flavours. There's such a broad mix of flavours amongst the islands, it's really hard to pin down a particular flavour profile of an island whisky. So it's always worth going online and reading reviews before you buy a bottle. I have a whole bunch of episodes planned to take a deep dive into each region specifically, give some history of the region, and go through some of the whiskies in my collection from each region and give you some tasting notes. So that's it, our fairly brief overview of the whisky producing regions of Scotland. Now remember, there will always be exceptions to the rules. Where a whisky comes from doesn't strictly dictate what it tastes like, but it does give you a really good idea of what you can generally expect of a whisky from a particular region. It can help as a really good starting point when trying to work out what whiskies you like. The majority of websites categorise whiskies by these regions. So if you have a good idea of the sort of whisky that you like, it can help to use these as a guide when buying. Whisky is somewhat of a journey, and as you experience different whiskies from different regions, you can find more and more things that you do and do not like. There are lots of whiskies here which at first I wasn't a huge fan of, but then once I found another whisky from a particular region or a particular style that I enjoyed, I found it as somewhat of a gateway that kind of led me to that whisky, and before you know it, some of the whiskies here I would never have considered some of my favourites, but I'd now put them up in my top 5. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like this video, please do drop a like down below and leave me a comment telling me if there's any particular whisky regions that you find that you gravitate to the most. If you'd like to help the channel, please click the subscribe button down below and click the bell icon to be notified whenever I upload. And on that note, Slàinte mhath.